The resolve in the original preamble was to constitute India into a sovereign. Two further words, secular and socialist, were introduced by the 42nd Amendment, and they hardly make a change to the concept or the idea that the Constitution conveys. Our Constitution embraces the kind of socialism that was defined by John Rawls as one providing equal opportunity. The constitutional principle of secularism is that the state is not guided by any religion, but the state is equally sympathetic of all religions rather than the state not recognizing any religion. Constitutions are designed to define the parameters of authority between several institutions of the government actors and individuals. But the constitutions usually indicate and give an identity and direction to the society that they seek to serve. The basic structure doctrine, in its essence, says that there are some fundamental features of the Constitution which are immutable, inviolable. In that, you can have a facial surgery if you can afford one, but you cannot altogether replace your face. The celebrated Justice H.R. Khanna, accepting the basic structure doctrine as substantially correct, observed that any amending body organized within the statutory scheme, however verbally unlimited its power, is an authority. A leading jurist of our times, Mr. Khalid Nariman, delivered a lecture on the centennial birth anniversary of another giant, Ram Jethmalani. He observed and spoke at length that the basic structure doctrine had served the Republic well, and that on the very few occasions when the judiciary had struck down some constitutional amendment, it was on good judicial principles and not by resorting to the principle of interference. For the same reason that constitutions are born, you might need to change the constitution. A constitution may, for instance, be rigid and not keeping up with the times when you may need to change it. But the Indian Constitution, from its first amendment, when the executive clashed with what may have been perceived to be an elitist judiciary, elitist judiciary, the floodgates opened and several amendments have been issued. First and foremost, we must deliver on the promises that the Constitution speaks of. We must allow the female fetus a chance to be born. We must allow basic education, shelter, and food to all. And after we've achieved these objectives and the basic awareness which is at the heart of democracy, where people vote according to the conscience of being aware, then when we talk about a new constitution, what then this one could have delivered. Thank you. Jai.
Thank you very much, Justice Banerjee. And before I do anything, I have to make my first amendment of the day, which is I forgot to mention to you the name of our very important timekeeper. She's Dr. Shubhasri Mojumdar. So, and she's hiding herself in the background, but she's a very important person in this debate. I think the proposition has launched the debate exactly as we would have expected to, saying that the largest written constitution on this planet is very comprehensive, yet admitting that in only 8 decades of existence, it has had to be amended 105 times. Compared with the American Constitution, written in 1787, in 1788, which up to today has been amended just 27 times. Justice Banerjee also told you about the famous Supreme Court ruling in the Kesavananda Bharati case, where it was explicitly stated that the doctrine of the Constitution cannot be altered, ring-fencing the extent of flexibility that the legislature has over the Constitution. Obviously, this is what prompted people like Dr. Vivek Debroy, one of the chief of the Economy Advisory Councils of the Prime Minister, to write a massive article saying India needs a new constitution. If you change a caterpillar too many times, it can become a butterfly, and then you don't recognize the original caterpillar when you look at the butterfly. Sometimes, of course, the caterpillar becomes a horrible, ugly moth as well. And then the question is, you don't call it a change, you call it a need for a metamorphosis or a new constitution. And I think speaking on that line will be the first speaker of the opposition, as I invite onto the dais Honorable Sengupta.
Respected Chairman, sir, and ladies and gentlemen, usually as the leader of the opposition in a parliamentary debate, one has to take on the Prime Minister. But today I have to take on both the Prime Minister and the Chief Minister, both of whom have argued in favor of the motion, and I will try my best. So let me start with a story. Acharya Kripalani, the noted freedom fighter, lived almost to 100, and during his later period, someone remarked to him on noting his great health, "Acharya Sahab, you have such a great constitution." He wryly smiled and said, "What constitution? It's only amendments." And by that time, when Kripalani had died in 1982, the Indian constitution had been amended a whopping 46 times. That is, 1.5 times every year. And now, as the Prime Minister pointed out, it has been amended 105 times. So for anyone who is supporting this motion, the first question that arises is, what constitution are we talking about? Are we talking about Ambedkar's original constitution? Are we talking about Nehru's amended constitution, which severely shrank fundamental rights to free speech and started land redistribution programs? Are we talking about Indira Gandhi's Garibi Hatao constitution with a raft of socialist-inspired amendments, including the words socialist and secular in the preamble that were adverted to? Or are we talking about the constitution by Prime Minister Narendra Modi with the idea of one nation with reservation on the basis of economic criteria and GST? Which constitution are we talking about, or are we, as the government today, is the government actually saying that Nehru, Gandhi and Modi are the same? I ask them, what is their case today? On this side of the house, we have a very simple proposition, that change in a constitutional scheme is natural. Not changing a constitution is unnatural. It perhaps is our view, and the view of the government here, that the story of the Indian Constitution began in 1950. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a product of our colonized minds. The fact is that India has had a constitutional culture that goes back a very long way, and it has an unbroken constitutional culture. If we go back to the Dharma Shastras, you will find that the idea of kingship is an idea of trust, of accountability, which is the core of constitutional thought today. If you go to the Mughal period, you will see the Dastan-ul-Amuls, which are essentially codes of administrative law. You will find Shahi Firmans, which are decisions made by Mughal rulers, and you will also find Ains, which is essentially the body called Jus Gentium, or the core corpus of law. That is nothing but core constitutional thought. And of course, in the British period, we had the Government of India Acts, culminating in the Constitution of India. India has had an unbroken constitutional culture for over 2000 years. The Constitution of India 1950 is one in that particular line. It is a wonderful constitution. Let me make it very clear right at the outset that this constitution does not need to be rejected wholesale, and that cannot be the argument of any sensible individual. But constitutions change, and this constitution, with 75 years of experience of independent India, needs to change too. So why should we embrace change? Let me offer you 3 arguments. There is one fundamental reason that I believe that we need to embrace change, and that is because the Constitution of India, as I argued in my recent book, The Colonial Constitution, is a colonial document. Let me give you 3 reasons. First, the Honorable Chief Minister came and spoke about the ED and the CBI. The Prime Minister here spoke about the ED as well. So ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you, why is it that in 75 years of our independent existence, and this is not a party political issue, but in 75 years of our independent existence, not a single government has come up with a manifesto of having a CBI Mukt Bharat. There has not been a single government of any party that has come up with this manifesto. In the last 20 years, we have not had a single party say that we want an ED Mukt Bharat. Why is that so? And what does the Constitution have to do with it? Ladies and gentlemen, the Constitution of India creates the basis of a police state. Let me tell you why. Article 21 of the Constitution is the most fundamental of our fundamental rights. That is the right to life and personal liberty. But that is followed by a lesser known article, which is Article 22, that legitimizes preventive detention, which essentially means the ability of the police to be able to pick you up, throw you in prison on a whim for a matter of days or weeks. So ladies and gentlemen, the Constitution of India has this dubious distinction of having a preventive detention provision in a fundamental rights chapter. Why is that so? The framers of the Constitution were undoubtedly concerned about law and order. They were debating the Constitution at the time of partition. In fact, the day they were debating the preventive detention provision, there were riots in Paharganj, which they had to cross over before they could reach Parliament House. But those riots ended in 2 days. The partition violence ended in 2 years. But the provision on preventive detention continues in the Constitution and not as a theoretical construct. In 2022, whereas there were 58 lakh people who were arrested in this country, by arrest I mean following a proper legal process, in comparison, 86.6 lakh people were detained, that is, picked up by the police and thrown in without any reason whatsoever being provided. So the basis of this idea of the police state comes from the Constitution. This has fostered 2 stepchildren, the CBI and the ED. So if the CBI and the ED are misbehaving, then maybe we should complain about the parents as well. Let me give you the second reason as to why I think the Constitution needs to change, and perhaps the Honorable Chief Minister might have agreed with me on this, is that the Constitution sets up what I call in my book a New Delhi Darbar. It is heavily centralized. Take the recent judgment of the Supreme Court in the Article 370 case. I don't want to get into the merits of that judgment, but they said one thing there which was quite alarming, which is that under President's rule, a President can exercise all or any functions of the state government that includes dividing a state and exterminating its existence. So let's take a hypothetical situation. Let's take a central government, not this one, that doesn't like the government of West Bengal, against not this one, but this has been a common occurrence in the history of West Bengal for many, many decades, that we don't get along with governments at the center. And suppose they don't like it, and they impose President's rule and decide that now Golkha land will be an independent state. Now, I don't want to deny anybody's claims to Gorkha land, but I don't think anybody can argue that that would be a legitimate way of doing this. But the Constitution, according to the Supreme Court, sanctions that. So should we not revisit the over-centralization in the Constitution? And finally, the Constitution is a colonial document because it is taken heavily from the Government of India Act 1935. Health and education were two key levers that were necessary in any constitutional framework. But they find place only in one provision, that is health, and 6 provisions out of 395 in education. The Constitution today has no provisions that deal with the internet and data security. The Constitution today needs to keep up with the times. And what I have spoken about, the parts that need to keep up with the times, is about 2/3 of the constitutional text. So why not take those parts of the Constitution which are good, put it in a new structure that works. Now, side government might come here and say that why not amend the Constitution only? Why do you want to change it? But as I've said, this is 2/3 of the Constitution text, and we can take what is good from this Constitution and take it into a new structure. So let me end with one point, which is really the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is that the talk of a new Constitution gives people fear that this is the onset of a constitutional Hindu Rashtra. This is really the fear in everyone's heads. Talking about the new Constitution, we're going to create a Hindu Rashtra. What I have tried to show today is that the debate on the Constitution is not a debate that focuses around 50 years. It is a debate that spans centuries. Change has happened over centuries. So I urge everyone here not to see this through narrow Modi-tinted glasses. The Constitution is not that kind of issue. And if you don't want to, then look at one document, which is the only constitutional document that has come out of the Sangh Parivar, and that is the Constitution of the Hindustan Free State in 1954, endorsed by Savarkar himself. And one provision really struck out for me, which is that it said no state religion. The possibility of Rashtra was shut by the Sangh Parivar in that document. For a new Constitution today, and I'll just, with the indulgence of the chair, will end in 30 seconds, calls for a new Constitution today is a call to essentially take the best of what the 1950 Constitution has to offer. The preamble, the equality clause, the non-discrimination clause, take the best of the Dharma Shastras, the best of Mughal constitutional scheme, and also our lived experience over the course of the last 75 years, so that the Indian Constitution continues to remain the conscience of the world. And because the Honorable Chief Minister quoted from Tagore, I can't help but quote from Tagore's Bharat Tirtho, because in Tagore's terms, the Constitution is like a Mongol ঘট, আর মঙ্গল ঘটটা এখনো ভরা হয়নি। তাই কবিগুরু লিখেছিলেন যে মার অভিষেকে এসো এসো তারা, মঙ্গল ঘট হয়নি যে ভরা, সবার পরশে পবিত্র করা তীর্থ দিয়ে এই ভারতের মহামানবের সাগর তীরে।
Thank you, Argo. I think the opposition lines are very clearly laid, and there are 3 major reasons why they think the Constitution needs to be changed. The first is, of course, the fact that it does not pay sufficient attention to health and education. I think those of us that are involved with these 2 aspects know that as a nation we have spent the least amount of GDP on the health and education sector and continue to do so. The second major point that he made was the point about what he called the New Delhi Darbar, the so-called pseudo-federalism that we have in our constitution, where the center and state are equal, but the center is more equal than the states. And we know that from the examples that he's quoted, that the relationship between the center and state in a true federal structure should have been the relationship between a benevolent mother and a very much loved daughter. What has happened in this country, particularly in this state, the relationship, I'm afraid, has become that between a very aggressive mother-in-law and a somewhat more aggressive daughter-in-law. And you know what happens when that occurs in a family. And finally, and this is the first reason he quoted, was that the Constitution should be scrapped because it smells of colonialism. And these were the three major points that the proposition feels the Constitution should be changed for. Looking at the president of the Calcutta Club, looking very unhappy in the front row, I wondered whether he had the thought that the Calcutta Club was also had a colonial origin, so maybe by the same argument it should be scrapped as well. Just as the language of this debate had a colonial origin, but we still debate in English here at the national debate. On that note, can I invite the second speaker for the motion, Rupen Roy, to cast his thoughts on the matter.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, sir, distinguished speakers. On my side, of course, someone has referred to him as the Prime Minister, of his physical resemblance, I guess. But he is our leader and distinguished members of the opposition. I am a little bit of an odd man out, odd person out, I would say, because I have never practiced law. I have all my life been a business consultant. And while preparing for this debate, I read what Dr. Ambedkar, his formal education was. And what I found was that he had 2 degrees, doctoral degrees, one from University of Columbia in New York. You know, it was not fashionable at that time to go there. People went to Oxford and Cambridge. And the subject of his thesis was ancient Indian commerce. And in LSE, he was more like Dr. Raghuram Rajan. His subject of his thesis was the problems of the Indian rupee. So I was a little assured that even though I have never practiced law, I would be able to contribute a little bit. Now, Constitution is not a holy book. You know, you cannot say that only 4 Brahmin priests will interpret the Vedas or 4 Arabic knowing Maulavis will interpret the Quran. Every Indian is a stakeholder in the Constitution. It's not just judges, lawyers, professors, historians, and economists who are impacted. Every one of you, doctors, nurses, Ahmadi, they are all stakeholders in this Constitution, because although in the drawing rooms we say that, oh, I am a taxpayer, my money is being wasted. The fact is that GST gathers 18 trillion rupees, whereas income tax only 30. And the poorest of poor person pays taxes. And therefore, he is a stakeholder in how the nation is going to be run. The first thing that I think Mr. Chairman also alluded to is that is the Indian Constitution too long? Now, my worthy opponent argued in favor of changing the Constitution. What I did not hear, and I am not a legal expert, so maybe I heard it wrong, I did not hear him say, let us throw out the Constitution and have a new one. He was talking about changes. And changes to the Constitution are happening. There have been 106 amendments to the Constitution so far. Now, first argument is too long. The US Constitution has 3543 words including signatures. The Indian Constitution has 145,000 words. But everything Indian is not bad and everything American is not good, because the Constitution of Alabama, which is a state in the United States, has 373,274 words. If you look at the holy books, Quran has got 77,430 words. King James's Bible has 788,280 words. And Mahabharata has 1.8 million words. Now this, if you say I want to cut the Constitution or change the Constitution or mutilate the Constitution because it's too long, I am reminded of a person called Procrustes, if you have read Greek mythology. He was a Greek Gunda. What he used to do was, he used to get his victims he had an iron bed of a certain size. And if you are short like me, he would beat them up so that he elongated their figure. And if he was tall, then he would cut their feet. So are we trying to say that just because this is long, we need to fit it to a certain size? In business we say force-fitting somebody or force-fitting a narrative, facts to a narrative is proscestus. Now, we have heard this word many times that Indian constitution is colonial. Now, I think it's a matter of a very supreme irony that all the members of the opposition are products of the Jesuit schools in the English medium, and we are debating here Banglaয় বিতর্ক করছি না, French করছি না, not in Hindi but in English. So what we have to understand is whatever is foreign is not synonymous with colonial. Tagore, when he wrote the mission statement of Vishwabharati, he said Vishwabharati's obligation is to offer others the hospitality of our best culture and the right to accept from them their best. So there is no harm, and the sponsor of this debate is Sister Nivedita University. She was born in Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom. The secretary of Tagore, Elmhurst, served in the British Army. He was an Englishman. So, should be our motto. So therefore it does not matter whether we borrowed something from France, something from US, something from UK, it does not become colonial. Just because your chip is designed in Silicon Valley does not become an imperialist computer or a phone. So we have borrowed ideas. Our constitution is not colonial. Our constitution served us for the last 74, 75 years, and it has upheld our liberty and our rights. Now, when we talk about colonial constitution, we talk about 7th schedule, IPS, preventive prevention, emergency, role of governor, and so on and so forth. But I think what we need to do is to understand is that these things can be amended. It's a living document, we can change, adapt, and get rid of what we don't like. It does not mean that we have to throw the baby with the bathwater. Now, I think I will say two things. One is that there was a very famous play in Bengal called Manjari Amer Manjari. It was from Chekhov's Cherry Orchard, where the Lalu, who wins the orchard by auction, he is a capitalist, rising capitalist, he comes and says, "Bhang beta bhang, noya jinis hobe, dam diye dibo." So if I don't know what I am going to have in place of the Belgian cut glass chandelier, he is breaking it. We don't know what will come in its place. So I don't think that just breaking things, smashing things is the right thing to do. It has served our purpose, it has done us well, and we need to make sure that it is preserved and we are proud of it. Lastly, I would like to say that we should not look only at the past. We must look at the future to see how our constitution will cope. Today if there was no internet at the time of the drafting of the constitution, so you can't look at Das Kapital or read the speech of Shyamakanta Mukherjee to say how internet will be handled. If you want to shut down internet in Manipur or Kashmir or West Bengal, how is the constitution going to handle it? Artificial intelligence is going to completely change the world. It is going to take away many jobs. Even the legal system will be impacted. The backlog of cases can come down through the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence, and that project is underway. So, climate change in an interconnected world requires rule of law which is interdependent between countries. So let us think of how future challenges will come, how AI will impact our society, how internet, digital world, synthetic currencies, these are the new things that will come. Let us not crib over the fact that, oh, why is IPS there? Why is the government there? Those are matters for experts and historians to write books on and argue among each other. But I think we need to look at the future and see how the world is changing and therefore how our constitution can adapt itself. And let us take pride in our constitution and not behave like Proscestes and say that I have to fit this constitution is too long, let us cut it, or that it is colonial, let's jettison it, or that this constitution has outlived its utility, therefore we must have a new one without saying what it would be. So, my submission is that no sane human being will say that, and that case has so far not been made. Maybe some of our other opposition members will raise that point, but no one has said, let us throw this constitution out lock, stock and barrel. We know that a constitution must have amendment, but amendment does not mean India needs a new constitution. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupendra. I will not speak a lot, but just remind the audience of a historical fact which you might want to ponder over while the next speaker against the motion comes to the dais. And that is that since the Second World War, 12 Asian countries that gained independence have drafted their own constitutions. Today in 2024, out of these 12 constitutions that were written post-World War II, only 3 have survived: Taiwan's, Korea's, and India's. 9 have been scrapped or changed completely. On that note, may I ask Vikramjit Banerjee to speak against the motion.
Thank you, respected Chairman, sir. My learned friends of the proposition, my worthy opponents and friends. Now, when we talk about this topic, we have to decide 2 things. The first thing is, what is the Constitution? Is the Constitution, as the Americans say, is the text which you see. Those provisions, that statute book, is that the Constitution? If that is the Constitution, then in 1949, when the Constitution was framed, it had 395 provisions. Today, it has 448 provisions. The Constitution has been changed over and over again. What my learned friends of the proposition are arguing is that you can change it by parts, but you need not relook at the Constitution. You know, you can change a car completely, but you can't buy yourself a new car, or you can't even think of buying yourself a new car. Now, if you look at, that's the way the Americans look at it. Now, that is why the Americans have very few amendments in their constitution. Now, let's look at it, let us look at constitutional law, which my learned friends talk about. Let's fundamental based on which the governance of this country or any country is run. Now, I will give you some examples of constitutional law which runs the country, which is not necessarily part of the document. First, I don't know how many of you know there was an Article 35A of a presidential order which was incorporated through the use of Article 370, classifying residents of Jammu and Kashmir as different from the rest of India. You know that? That was a presidential order. That did not technically exist as part of the Constitution. Do you know that the definition of who is a scheduled caste and Dalit is made through a presidential order? Do you know that, most incredibly, that we talk about reservations, which is such an integral part of our Constitution and our constitutional scheme, that it is made through an office memorandum of the Department of Personnel and Training in 1993. So this is what you are talking about your constitution. Whether you want to define who is a minority, that is defined in terms of the National Minorities Act. That the constitution has some basic features that is defined by Kishananda Bharati, which my learned friend spoke about. So if you are talking about these things, and even the definition of secularism, that the definition of secularism is not the American secularism, but we have an Indian secularism, that is defined by judgments of the Supreme Court. Constitutions change, constitutional law changes, and it changes all the time. And there is nothing sacrosanct about it. Now the next thing, let's talk about something more important, something which weighs with the court, with the Honorable Chief Minister spoke about, with my learned friend spoke about. Let's talk about questions of the values of the Constitution. Jefferson, I don't know how many of you know, Jefferson was one of the founding fathers of the American Constitution. Jefferson said, very interestingly, he said, every constitution should be only for 20 years. Because this generation does not have a right to bind future generations. So I can only make a constitution for myself. Second, I don't know how many of you know this, that when the word secularism and socialism was suggested to be brought into the Constitution by the Constituent Assembly, it was rejected 4 times. I don't know how many of you know that K.T. Shah, who was a member of the Constituent Assembly, kept on proposing, saying that incorporate socialism and secularism. Then Baba Saheb Ambedkar gets up and says, in the end he can't handle it anymore. So he gets up and says, I don't want values into the Constitution. Don't put values in the Constitution. Because who knows what the future, what values they would hold, what sort of form of governance they would like. Even Baba Saheb Ambedkar agreed that this Constitution is a journey, not an end. You look at even Justice Matthew and Keshavananda Bharati speaking about basic structure, said, what is basic structure today may not be basic structure tomorrow. I'm sure as it was discussed, secularism and socialism were brought into the Constitution by the 42nd Amendment, which was made during the emergency. What permanent values are we talking about? Right to your fundamental property, fundamental right of property was taken away in 1978 under the Janata government and put in as a constitutional right away from a fundamental right. These are fundamental values of governance. It was changed. Now let's come on to the other very important question. Do you think that everything is perfect with this Constitution? Does anyone here think that this Constitution is perfect? It's incredible. There is nothing wrong in it. I don't think anyone says that. If you said that, there wouldn't be so many amendments. I think any one of us who rationally discusses the Constitution will never say that there's nothing wrong in the Constitution. The Constitution, and which no one talks about, but anyone who studies constitutional law will know that the basic structure, the structure of the Constitution is based on the Government of India Act of 1935 with the Fundamental Rights chapter, with a chapter on directive principles of state policy, and then subsequent amendments to Nyayapalika and Panchayat and Nagarpalika subsequently later. But the basic structure of the Constitution as we know it is a direct replica of the Government of India Act 1935. Now there's nothing wrong in it. But the fact that it was framed, it was not even discussed in India. It was discussed in the Parliament of Britain. Now of course we are speaking English. But there is no doubt about it that our people like us did not apply their mind as to how the structure, the basic structure and fundamental power or dynamics of this Constitution were ever going to be framed. Now, let us discuss another question. Are you satisfied with the way federalism was? The Honorable Chief Minister wasn't. Don't you think that takes a look? Don't you think we also need to take a look of how to make our elected representatives more accountable to us? Don't you think we should also look at how judges select judges in this country? We need to take a look at all these things. Do we also take a look at as to whether we need to bring back fundamental right to property into the Constitution? I think we should. Don't you think that we should have a mechanism to ensure that various different things which have gone wrong in our constitutions are corrected? Of course, we need to look at it over and over again. And most importantly, and this is what was discussed, and this is the crux of this debate today. Don't you think that in this age where Black Lives Matter, in this age when statues of colonialists throughout the world are being torn down one after another in the highest of high places, and even in Oxford, statues of roads are brought down. Don't you think in this age it is important for us to discuss decolonization? And in this city where we brought down the biggest colonial empire in the world. Of course, people died for it, people physically fought for it, and we managed it. It was greatly difficult, 200 years old, and a colonial empire which stretched the entire world, which is physically powerful. We brought it down. We not only brought it down by physically fighting for it, but we brought it down by our ideas. We brought it down and destroyed it with our ideas. Don't you think that after 70 years, it is time to think about it? Because the ideas which started off in India, in this city, spread all over the world and changed the world forever. The ideas of decolonization started in this city, in these wonderful institutions in this city, the institutions of discussion, the institutions where the Raj was taken on. And isn't it time now, isn't this place a good enough place to start that discussion once again? What better place, what better time? But Bengal thinks today, India will think tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vikramjit. Again, the only thing I can think of when hearing the Additional Solicitor General of India speak is a quotation by Charles Darwin, and you will forgive me for being a man of biology. But Darwin wrote in his Survival of the Fittest, and I quote Darwin, he said, "The Homo sapiens is not the strongest of the species that survive, nor is it the most intelligent species on this planet. However, it is the one most responsive to change. And that's what makes me vote it as the fittest species on the planet." On that note, I invite Prosenjit Bose to deliver his thoughts in favor of the motion.
সকলকে নমস্কার। Esteemed chairperson of the session, distinguished fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. We have been offered a very peculiar argument on behalf of the opposition, which is basically creating straw men. We are not really so far debating the elephant in the room. We need to change the constitution, we need a new constitution because the right to education in the constitution is not there properly. See, so many people are still out of school 75 years after independence. You see, we have to change the constitution because the right to healthcare has not been given. There is, the sedition law is still there, and preventive detention is there. All kinds of things are being said.
But is that the reason why the powers that we at the center today want to change the constitution? I think that is the biggest, the elephant in the room that we are not discussing in the debate. Don't be aggressive. Please come to the point. You cannot discuss the American Constitution without discussing America's Declaration of Independence. You cannot discuss the French Constitution, the Republican French Constitution, without discussing the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. You cannot discuss India's Constitution without reference to the freedom struggle which gave birth to that Constitution. And what was that freedom struggle? The core of the ideological debate during the freedom struggle was there are many debates. Gandhi didn't agree with Nehru, Nehru didn't agree with Ambedkar, Bhagat Singh didn't agree with Gandhi, Subhash Chandra Bose had his own issues with non-violence, and so on and so forth. But every freedom fighter worked his salt, always believed that this fight for our country's freedom is for everybody, irrespective of your religion, your caste, your creed. We will create a country which is for everybody. That is the core of the debate. And those who oppose that it is that with all its debates, that is why it is so long. There are so many debates. This constitution in a society 2000 years old, which didn't allow people, there was untouchability. There are religious texts which say it poured molten lead in the ears of women and Dalits if the mantras of Veda entered their ears. And this constitution, this revolutionary constitution in one stroke put an end to untouchability. Gave equal rights to people. Said that one person, one vote, one value. You can be a big businessman, you can be a rickshaw puller, you can be a farmer, you are all equal. That is the core issue that is at stake. So when you are talking about a new constitution, yes, that is where our leader from our side has put it very categorically that the fundamental, the basic structure of the constitution, that is what is at stake. So whatever else you raise, those are minor issues. The constitution has been changed many times. You can keep on changing them. But what cannot be changed is the fact that this is a secular country. This is a country that belongs to all. This is a democracy. This is a multi-party democracy. What happened to the Soviet Union? Learn from the mistakes. Learn from the mistakes. What has happened to China? They today in 2018, they even removed that two-term restriction on the post of president. And when you are talking about a new constitution, today the people who are in power, what did their ancestors do? They never believed in this secular vision of composite nationalism. They were talking about the Hindu Rashtra for the past almost 100 years. And they were saying that this should be because it's a Hindu majority country, the minorities should not have any right. They eulogized Hitler. They said we should learn. This is, I'm quoting from Golwalkar. He said we should learn from Hitler and his treatment of the Jews. That is what we should do to our minorities. This is the ideological mission of those who are in power. And in that context, when they are in power, they are talking about one nation, one vote. Why should there be one vote in one nation when it's a federal constitution where there are so many states? So in that context, when you talk about whether we need a new constitution, it becomes a debate over the core ideological principles. And please take a position on that debate. Don't bring these side issues that you are bringing. Where do you stand on that debate? And I think that this August House will agree that the framers of our constitution had this in mind, that India is a very old civilization. You see the kind of debates we are having today. These are not these Chinese legal debates that happen in social media. Suddenly we see from the government side, India should not be called India anymore. Why? Only Bharat. Article 1 of our constitution says, India, that is Bharat. They say, no, Bharat is from Vedas, big Vedas. So what? India is also a very, where does the name India come from? From the Indus River. The name Hindu, the majority of our country, that Hindu comes from the name of that river, that civilization. In 5th century BC, you had Greek philosophers, Greek historians talking about Hindus. There was a Greek ambassador in Chandragupta Maurya's court, and he, Megasthenes, he wrote a book called Indica. So even India, and it predates even the birth of the English language. It's not about British colonialism. It's not that the British came and called us India. We have been called India and we have been called Bharat from ancient times. That is the beauty of our culture. That is what the founding fathers and mothers of our country, they believed in from the core of their heart. What is unfortunate today is what are we seeing? That the powers of that be today, what are they attempting? One after the other, and it is most unfortunate. I don't want to explicitly criticize, but cannot but express one's anguish at certain judgments of the Honorable Supreme Court. A judgment which itself says that a structure, the way it was demolished, was wrong. It was unlawful. As something which is wrong, unlawful. It was demolished. And yet, what was allowed to happen on 22nd of January in our country? This state is secular, means the state doesn't have any religion. All of us are free to believe in what we believe in. But the state does not have any religion. Why should our constitution expressly prohibit taxpayers' money from being used to promote religious causes? There is a explicit provision. Why must the Indian Army, Indian Navy, and all the members of the state, they are being utilized for the and that too on the eve of a Lok Sabha election, which is the example of mixing religion with politics, which is the antithesis of secularism. This is the, I think, election in which the powers that be want to change the constitution. And there, I think that the answer to this, especially from Bengal, from Calcutta, the response would be a resounding no, that we do not want such a change in India's constitution. India's constitution should remain firmly secular, democratic, and republican. That is the way we have been. That is the way we will survive all together, irrespective of our religious beliefs, our political beliefs, or whatever we will all remain as Indians if we remain true to this core vision of our freedom struggle, which is enshrined in our constitution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prasenjit, for bringing in a definitely new angle to this debate and pointing out the main apprehension of the proposition today, or one of the main apprehensions of the proposition today. The new constitution may no longer incorporate the word secular as a part of this country's aims. And I think that is an apprehension that is resounding across the board. Those who feel the constitution should not be changed. In fact, even democracy, he points out, would be at peril if the constitution is changed. And as I say, already democracy in this country has changed. When we say it is for the people, by the people, of the people, today we should spell it for the people, F-A-R, the people, by the people, B-Y-E, the people, and of the people, O-double-F, the people. And therefore democracy can be interpreted on those that are in power. We talk a lot about our freedom of speech. There is no doubt that both of us have freedom of speech in the country. But today the question is, both in this state and in the center, do we have freedom after our speech? And that's the question I often ask.
and defeatist motion placed before this august House. The arguments so far put forward by my friends on the other side are based on fables and fairy tales about the founding moment of our republic. I could understand Justice Ranjit Ganchi and Mr. Upin Roy believing in such fairy tales dished out by our so-called liberal commentators. But I was astonished that Mr. Prosenjit Bose seemed to also fall for these fables. Has he forgotten the sophisticated leftist critiques of the Constitution of 1950 as it was being framed? Has he forgotten the speeches of Jyoti Basu in the West Bengal Legislative Assembly against the West Bengal Security Act and the emergency provisions both in Malaya and in India of that period? More than 100 years ago, Subhash Chandra Bose wrote to Deshabandhu Chittaranjan Das on 2nd March 1921 that we must now craft India's constitution based on Swaraj. Swarajের ভিত্তির উপর আমাদের এখন ভারতের constitution তৈরি করিতে হইবে. We as a people never did so. Instead, we adapted and adopted what Argho Sengupta has eloquently called the colonial constitution that had held us in bondage, and we inherited the worst features of colonial authoritarianism. The Constitution of 1950 was by no means the culmination of our freedom struggle. And that is why there is an urgent need today to fearlessly engage of ideas so that we can produce a new, genuinely democratic constitution that would be built on the pillars of egalitarianism, federalism, and religious harmony. Argho has already told you about the long and deep constitutional culture of India, going back to ancient times and through the age of the Mughal Empire. What I would like to emphasize is what a young historian, a student of mine, Aniket Dey, has called a robust political tradition of anti-colonial constitutionalism. The British tried to rule us with their old constitutional devices of 1909, 1919, and then the Government of India Act of 1935. They wanted to perpetuate British colonial rule. But our freedom fighters had a different conception of what a constitution should be. Even the word Sangvidhan was used by Rabindranath Tagore in his essays Swadeshi Samaj. And 100 years ago, the Swarajists led by Deshabandhu Chittaranjan Das and Subhash Chandra Bose had produced a federal constitution at the same time as they introduced a pact for the equitable sharing of power between Hindus and Muslims. There were many such constitutions in those days. The Socialist Republican Association produced a constitution. The Khabar Party produced a constitution. We have this tradition of anti-colonial constitutionalism which was not reflected when we won independence. We never had a popularly elected constituent assembly. Subhash Chandra Bose had rejected in 1939 the Indian National Congress's proposal of a constitutional convention under imperialist auspices. Sinn Féin had rejected Lloyd George's constitutional convention, and for Prosenjit Bose, A genuine constituent assembly with popular sanction could only have been created after the seizure of power by our nationalists. Instead, we have an directly elected assembly, elected by state legislators, who themselves had been elected based on very limited franchise. And yet, there were some members of the Constituent Assembly who still wanted to cling to the ideals of the freedom struggle. Unlike the Congress High Command, led by Jawaharlal Nehru, who were turning their backs on the freedom struggle's ideals and opting for post-colonial continuity, there were those who came forward to uphold those ideals. And we introduced an amendment to Article 1 to declare that India shall be a secular federal socialist union of states. Now it's true, as Vikramji pointed out, that secularism and socialism ideologies, which Ambedkar didn't want to put into the constitution, the idea of a federal union of states has become extremely salient again today. Another member of the Constituent Assembly, Hari Vishnu Kamath, strenuously argued against the emergency provisions that were introduced in Part 18. And he said that these were like Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, which Hitler had used to facilitate his dictatorship. And he said it was a day of sorrow and shame when emergency provisions were included in our Constitution, and even the suspension of habeas corpus, the basic individual liberty, became part of our Constitution. Ambedkar thanked these rebels of the Constitution, saying that they had enlivened the proceedings, but ultimately they were not able to contribute to the substance of the final product. Ambedkar conceded during the debates that these provisions, these authoritarian features, might be misused in the future, and he simply expressed the pious hope that they will not be brought into operation and that they will remain a dead letter. By contrast, Sharat Chandra Bose, in an article in Indian Law Review in January of 1950, said that these were like time bombs, which posed a grave threat to Indian democracy in the future. So we have authoritarianism that needs to be expunged. Also, we failed on the front of federalism. During the emergency, 4 out of 5 judges of the Supreme Court said that the suspension of habeas corpus was perfectly constitutional. I would like to know from Justice Ranjit Banerjee whether he agreed with the dissent of Justice Khanna or the view of the 4 other judges who carried it. Look at the recent verdict on Kashmir, which has already been referred to from this side of the House. What I will add is that the implications of this judgment are dire. It has been said that our Constitution gives the President the right to divide and change the status of any state of the Union. It is not just a question of Goraland. Under President's rule, the Centre can divide Bengal between North and South and reduce us to the status of 2 Union territories. Nothing could be a greater affront to the question of federalism and democracy in this country. Finally, I would really want to return to the question of preventive detention. That is because we oppose the UAPA and the amendment pushed through in 2019 by the central government. But how can we forget that it was the same Constituent Assembly sitting as the Provisional Parliament of India which in February of 1950 passed the most draconian law, Preventive Detention Act, That was the basis of the sacrifice of our liberties. And so finally, I will simply, with the indulgence of the chair, say that all of you sitting in this audience, and I see many young faces, have the right to decide what kind of constitution should govern us in the 21st century. And therefore, the need of the hour, let me emphasize need, the need of the hour is a new constitution. And let me also emphasize the word new. And let us at long last craft a constitution of India on the basis of Swaraj that Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose had called for more than 100 years ago. Jai Hind.
Thank you, Shubhadada. I think a very noteworthy sentence in his speech, one of the reasons that we need to get a new constitution is because authoritarianism needs to be expunged, suggesting therefore that the present dispensation in power does not believe in authoritarianism at all, and they will have a constitution which will not have any hint of authoritarianism. I will not pass any judgment on this matter, but I will pass it on to the last speaker, speaking for the motion, Alka Lamba, who might have a word to say about this.
रसगुल्लों और मिठास की नगरी कैलकाटा में और कैलकाटा क्लब के इस प्रांगण में टेलीग्राफ द्वारा आयोजित इस चर्चा में आप सभी को मेरा जय संविधान। आज यहाँ पर मैं उस संविधान को बचाने के लिए खड़ी हुई हूँ जिस संविधान ने अब तक हमें बचाया है। आज ये नौबत आ गई कि जिस संविधान की पे हमारे इस भारत की मजबूत नींव और एक बुलंद इमारत खड़ी है, आज वो हिल रही है और हमसे कह रही है आगे बढ़ो। ये संविधान पर हमला नहीं है, ये लोकतंत्र पर हमला है, ये हमारी आजादी पर हमला है। मैं देख रही हूं कि आजादी के इस आजाद भारत में मेरे जैसे जो युवा हैं, उनका इस आजादी में कहे तो खून तो दूर की बात, पसीना भी बहाने को नहीं मिला। लेकिन आज हमारे कंधों पर ये जिम्मेदारी आ गई है कि जो विरासत में हमें ये संविधान मिला है, आज इस संविधान की रक्षा करने के लिए खड़ी हूं और पूरी ईमानदारी के साथ अंतिम सांस तक इस संविधान पर आज नहीं आने दूंगी। इस मंच पर अकेली नारी हूं, पंक्ति में अंतिम खड़ी हूं। मैं नहीं हूं, मैं भारत की नारी हूं और मुझे यह अधिकार मेरे संविधान ने दिया है। इस संविधान ने ही संशोधन के माध्यम से पंचायत और नगर निगमों में इस आदि आबादी को हक दिया कि 14 लाख हमारी बहनें इस देश में पंच और सरपंच हैं, नगर निगम और मेयर हैं और अपनी आवाज बुलंद कर रही हैं। कैसे उन आवाजों का हनन हम होने दें? आज बात हो रही है आजादी की। लोकतंत्र में बार बार कहा जाता है लोकतंत्र की हत्या हो रही है, आवाजों को कुचला जा रहा है। मैं भारत की राजधानी दिल्ली से आ रही हूँ, बहुत से कॉन्क्लेव, बहुत से बड़े चैनल डिबेट कर रहे हैं, लेकिन 5 सितारा के बंद कमरों में एक दिशा निर्देश के तहत ये कलकत्ता में ही संभव देख रही हूँ कि खुला मंच है, पक्ष और विपक्ष है और लोगों के बीच में अदालत लगी हुई है। काश ये नजारा दिल्ली में देखने को भी मिलता। कलम यहाँ पर बार बार दिखाई गई। एक कलम है जो आजादी से लिखती हुई नहीं दिख रही, वो कलम दोबारा दिखाई जाए। 2 मजबूत हाथों ने उस कलम को पकड़ा हुआ है, थामा हुआ है। क्यों थामा हुआ है? वो कलम कैसी दिखनी चाहिए थी? आजादी से, स्वतंत्रता से लिखते हुए। लेकिन आज उस कलम पर उस कलम पर कमल हावी हो चुका है, इसलिए दो मजबूत हाथ उसे थामे बैठे हैं। यानी ग्राफ के लिए, उसकी बहादुर पत्रकारिता के लिए, लोकतंत्र के उठते सवालों को मुख्य पत्र पर छापना, सवाल करना, उसके लिए मैं आपका साधुवाद करती हूँ कि आप वो हिम्मत दिखा रहे हैं। भारतीय राष्ट्रीय महिला कांग्रेस की राष्ट्रीय अध्यक्ष हुई, मुझे अभी खुद 40 दिन नहीं हुए। इन 40 दिनों में 20 राज्यों से होकर यहाँ पर पहुंची। 20 के 20 राज्यों में इस संविधान को लेकर, वन नेशन वन इलेक्शन को लेकर हर तरह की चर्चा है, और मुझे लगता है चर्चा के पीछे मकसद सिर्फ एक है, वो है मेन मुद्दों से भटका देना। आज हमारा नेता श्री राहुल गांधी जी पहले भारत जोड़ो यात्रा 4000 किलोमीटर कन्याकुमारी से कश्मीर, और अब भारत जोड़ो न्याय यात्रा पूर्व से पश्चिम कर रहे हैं। 10,000 किलोमीटर की ये यात्रा देश के किसान हो, बेरोजगार युवा हो, महिला हो, आदिवासी हो, दलित हो, उनसे गुजर कर निकल रही है। आज लोकतंत्र है ना, तो लोकतंत्र तो ये कहता है कि संसद के अंदर चर्चा होनी चाहिए, कानून बनाने से पहले चर्चा होनी चाहिए, सहमतियां होनी चाहिए। क्या हुआ कृषि कानून को लेकर? तालेबंदी में तानाशाही से बिना संसद भवन के, बिना चर्चा के कानून थोप दिया गया हमारे अन्नदाताओं को। 1 साल आंदोलन चलता है, 700 किसान शहीद हो जाते हैं, और आज अभी इस समय भी हमारा किसान, हमारा आंदोलन दिल्ली की दहलीज पर आंदोलित कर रहा है। आवाजें नहीं सुनी जा रही, लोकतंत्र में कुचली जा रही है। पहली बार आविष्कार हुआ है कि ड्रोन से सफलतापूर्व आंसू गैस कैसे छोड़ी जाती है। इस पे आविष्कार हुआ है कि ड्रोन से पहली बार ये किया गया है। मैं सिर्फ आपसे यही कहूंगी, राहुल गांधी जी की यात्रा 5 बिंदुओं पर, वो पांचों के पांचों बिंदु हमारे संविधान में। नारी न्याय की बात हो रही है, युवा न्याय की बात हो रही है, भागीदारी न्याय की बात हो रही है, किसान न्याय और श्रमिक न्याय की बात हो रही है। बात इन पे होनी चाहिए, पर बात उन मुद्दों पर हो रही है जिसमें शायद इस देश में सहमतियां बनाने में भी समय लगेगा, लेकिन संख्या और बहुमत के दम पर आप उसे थोपने की कोशिश इस देश पर मत करिए। 150 सांसदों को संसद से 75 साल की आजादी में कभी नहीं हुआ कि संसद में एक बार में 150 सांसदों की आवाज को कुचल दिया जाए, उन्हें बाहर कर दिया जाए। और कैसे कानून आए? अभी हमारे साथी जो उधर से हैं, जजेस के बेंचेस की फैसलों के जिक्र कर रहे थे कि कब कब 5 जजेस की बेंच ने किस जो है संख्या से फैसले दिए। उस बेंच ने तो ये भी फैसला किया था कि 2024 के लोकतंत्र में जो है चुनावों से पहले चुनाव आयुक्त और 2 सदस्यों की नियुक्ति निष्पक्षता से होनी चाहिए। ये फैसला सत्ता नहीं करेगी, एक पैनल करेगा। उस पैनल में देश के प्रधानमंत्री होंगे, नेता विपक्ष होगा और मुख्य न्यायाधीश चीफ जस्टिस ऑफ इंडिया होंगे। किसी को इस लोकतंत्र में 140 करोड़ के भारत को पूछे, किसी को इस पर आपत्ति हो सकती थी, लेकिन सत्ता को आपत्ति थी, इसलिए संख्या का सांसदों को बर्खास्त करके विपक्ष के कानून बदल दिया कि मुख्य चुनाव आयुक्त और 2 सदस्यों की नियुक्ति 2024 के चुनावों से पहले एक पैनल नहीं करेगा, सत्ता करेगी। और आज तो मुख्य चुनाव आयुक्त, क्या मजबूरी है, क्या दबाव है, पूछना चाहते कि 5 महीने से कांग्रेस और हमारे विपक्ष की दल के नेता 5 महीने से मुख्य चुनाव आयुक्त से समय मांग रहे हैं। आप सोचिए ऐसा क्या होना चाहिए? और 5 महीने से मुख्य चुनाव आयुक्त पर क्या दबाव है, क्या मजबूरी है, क्या लालच है कि 24 से पहले आपको मिलना चाहते, 5 महीने से पत्र लिख रहे, पर वो हमें समय मिलने का नहीं देते। लोकतंत्र में बहुत से सवाल उठ रहे हैं। कृषि कानून हो, सेना की भर्ती, बिना किसी चर्चा के सेना के पूर्व जनरल ने कहा है, नरवाने जी ने, कि यह अग्निपथ ठेके की 4 साल की नौकरी सेना को कमजोर करने का काम करे। और बिल्कुल ऐसी कभी सेना में चर्चा नहीं हुई कि तीनों सेनाओं में से थोप दिया जाएगा, पक्की भर्तियां खत्म कर दी जाएंगी। शहीद से शहीद का दर्जा छीन लिया गया है, शहीद से उसका जो सम्मान था, कफन में तिरंगा, वो छीन लिया गया। कहाँ चर्चा हो रही है? 1.5 लाख युवा, भारत की राजधानी दिल्ली में 1.5 लाख युवा शारीरिक मानसिक परीक्षाओं से डरकर सरहद पर जाने के लिए तैयार खड़ा था। उसे भर्ती पत्र नहीं दिया, उसे ये कहा गया पक्की भर्ती खत्म कर दी गई है, ठेके की 4 साल की नौकरी है, करनी है करिए, नहीं करनी मत करिए। सवाल उठा लोकतंत्र में कि 4 साल के बाद क्या होगा, 4 साल के बाद क्या क्या होगा? तो जवाब मिलता है बड़े बड़े उद्योगपतियों के या बड़ी बड़ी उद्योग इंडस्ट्री में आपको चौकीदार की नौकरी दी जाएगी क्योंकि आप ट्रेन किए गए हैं सेना द्वारा। ये स्वीकार हमें नहीं है, इसलिए हम इसके ऊपर व्यापक चर्चा चाहते हैं। लेकिन तानाशाहियों से इस देश पे अगर चीजें थोपी जाएंगी, उन्हें कुचला जाएगा। ईडी का जिक्र किया जा रहा है। ईडी का कन्विक्शन रेट कितना है? 5000 से अधिक मामले दर्ज होते हैं, एफआईआर होती है, कितनों में चार्जशीट नहीं। कन्विक्शन रेट क्या है? 0.46। 10 साल कम थे। हम पूछना चाहते हैं, 10 साल कम थे, सत्ता में आप है, जांच एजेंसी आपकी, फाइल है आपकी, लेकिन सिर्फ विपक्ष की आवाजों को कुचलने के लिए आप संवैधानिक संस्थाओं का दुरुपयोग कर रहे हैं। कल खबर आती है कि कांग्रेस के 9 भाई खातों को इनकम टैक्स ने सीज कर दिया। एक हफ्ते में चुनावों की घोषणा है और हमारे बैंक खाते सीज किए जा रहे हैं। 200 करोड़ का जुर्माना लगाया जा रहा है। कारण 18 और 19 इनकम टैक्स भरने में 40 दिन की देरी की थी। 18 और 19 में देरी की थी। 5 साल बाद आज चुनावों की घोषणा से पहले आप हम पे 200 की पेनल्टी लगाते हैं, 200 करोड़ की, और हमारे खाते सीज करने की बात करते हैं। तो ये लोकतंत्र में क्या है? चिंता नहीं है कि कांग्रेस के खाते सीज किए गए, चिंता यह है कि ये विपक्ष है। लोकतंत्र में सत्ता के साथ विपक्ष की भी आवाजों को सुने जाना बेहद जरूरी है। विधानसभा में रही और मेरी नेता सोनिया गांधी जी जब हम सत्ता में तो मुझे कहती थी, अगर किसी को सुनो ना सुनो, सुषमा स्वराज को सुना करो। वो विपक्ष में है, कैसे बोलती है, कैसे मुद्दे उठाती है। कल को हम भी विपक्ष में हो सकते हैं, सीख लो सुषमा स्वराज से। ये मेरी नेता सोनिया गांधी ने कहा। उन नेता सोनिया गांधी ने जो बिल्लरी में सोनिया गांधी जी और सुषमा स्वराज जी आमने सामने लड़ती हैं, परिणाम जो भी हुए, दोनों का संसद में जो व्यापार था वो देखा हमने। ये लोकतंत्र है, लेकिन आज इस लोकतंत्र की आवाजों को कुचला जा रहा है। राहुल गांधी जी की सदस्यता छीन ली गई, उनकी सुरक्षा छीन ली गई, उनका सरकारी आवास छीन लिया गया, उन्हें 2 साल जेल भेजने की तैयारी की। बात यह है कि बात फिर कहूंगी राहुल गांधी की नहीं, 150 सांसदों की नहीं है जिन्हें सस्पेंड कर दिया गया। बात इस देश के संविधान की है, उस संविधान को आज बचाने की है, जिस संविधान ने आज आपको और हमें आजादी देकर यहाँ बिठा दिया। आज इस संविधान ने हमें चर्चा करने का अधिकार दिया हुआ। मैं आपसे हाथ जोड़कर ही कहूंगी, अगर हम अपने स्वतंत्रता सेनानियों को और अगर हम अपने संविधान निर्माताओं को सच्ची श्रद्धांजलि देना चाहते हैं, तो खड़े हो जाइए इस संविधान की रक्षा के लिए। संविधान की तरफ से 2 शब्द हैं, रातों के अंधेरों में भी, रातों के अंधेरों में भी मैं दीपक सदा जलाता हूँ। मैं भारत का संविधान हूँ, तुमको राह दिखाता हूँ। मौलिक अधिकार दिए तुमको, मौलिक अधिकार दिए तुमको, जीवन सहज बनाने को कर्तव्यों का लेखा सौंपा है, कर्तव्यों का लेखा सौंपा है। आदर्श नया गढ़ जाने को, ये हमारा संविधान है। जय संविधान, जय भारत।
Thank you, Alka. I think she highlighted how even with this constitution, there's a devious distortion of the democratic process. And fearing if we have a new one, it could probably make things worse for democracy. The question is, we have still allowed such devious distortions of democracy to be done under the umbrella of the present constitution. So where do we go from here? And no better person to show us the way than an ex-governor, an ex-politician, and a brilliant speaker by his own right. I invite Mr. Tathagata Rai, the last speaker for this debate.
Mr. Moderator, sir, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I was under the impression here that we are debating the question of whether we need a new constitution or not whether this provision of the constitution is good or that provision of the constitution is bad. We are debating whether we will have a new constitution or will go on endlessly amending the present constitution. Unfortunately, from the other side, I have not heard even a squeak in respect of that. Therefore, a duty that devolves on the last speaker, that is to refute the statements made by the other side, is made very simple. I don't have to do it. As a matter of fact, I will take umbrage under certain statements that the proposition themselves have made. You'd be surprised, but gradually I will slowly come to it. Ladies and gentlemen, think of a person who is trying to dress up for a very special occasion, and he puts on a suit of clothes, changes it, next 5 minutes he puts on another one, changes it again, then what is the conclusion that you will arrive at? You will arrive at the conclusion that he himself does not consider himself very handsome or pretty or any such thing. There is something wrong with his looks which he can't make good with a new suit of clothes. The problem with the Indian Constitution is basically that the Indian Constitution, ladies and gentlemen, was not made in a vacuum. As a matter of fact, right at the beginning, our Mr. Moderator had put the question or had a wonder why the Indian Constitution has 145,000 words, whereas the US Constitution, which is much older, has much fewer words, I think 8,000 recently. Why is it indeed? It is because we have had the advantage of drawing upon other constitutions. We have borrowed provisions from other constitutions. And this borrowing is not a bad thing. The borrowing, we are gaining by other people's experiences. We have used as the basis of our constitution the Government of India Act 1935, which was passed in the British Parliament and debated over there. No Indian had any part to play in it, but nevertheless it was debated, it was considered, and then some part of it was used, some part of it was rejected. Then we have to look at the other constitutions from which the Indian Constitution is drawn upon. Apart from the Government of India Act, we of course have drawn upon the British unwritten constitution, because the British don't have any written constitution, as we all know. But we have drawn upon the British constitution and we have given ourselves the concept of parliamentary system or the cabinet system of government as opposed to the presidential system. We have drawn upon the American Constitution, whereby we have given ourselves fundamental rights, judicial review, impeachment of the president, and several others. In 250 years, this American Constitution, which is the very first written constitution of the world, had undergone only 27 ratified amendments. Six further amendments have been proposed, but they are still unratified. We have drawn upon the French Constitution. The French had several republics, totally different constitutions. They are now in the Fifth Republic. The Fifth Republic was established in 1958. And in these years, all these years, since 1958, there have been 17 amendments. Thus, in American Constitution, 27 ratified amendments in 250 years, that makes it one amendment in 1 year, approximately. Similarly, the French Constitution makes it one amendment in 4 years. The Canadian Constitution was one in which we drew upon, because Canada was earlier governed by the British North America Act. Later on, since 1982, they have had a constitution from which we have adopted a very important thing called the quasi-federal system. The quasi-federal system, which means a federation with a very strong center. Now, this has been looked upon askance by several panelists over here, both from that side and from our side also. Now, I am not on the merits of it, but the point is that this was done because the constitution framers, in their wisdom, saw that India was such a varied country that there could be vociferous tendencies. There could be centrifugal tendencies. In short, in very earthy Hindi, there could be tukre gang. We have to put peg to them, we have to extinguish them, any such tukre gang. That is why I drew upon the Canadian Constitution to have it. Now, Canadian Constitution, in 42 years of its existence, they have had 13 amendments, that is one in 3 years, roughly. The Irish Constitution, we have drawn upon it. Irish Constitution has given us the directive principles and the method of electing president. They have had, in 87 years, they have had 32 amendments, that is roughly one amendment in 2.5 years. The Australian Constitution, we have also drawn upon. Australian Constitution has given us the idea of concurrent list, and the Australian Constitution has even fewer amendments. In 124 years, they have had 8 amendments, which means 1 in 16 years. And our Indian Constitution, in the 75 years of its existence, we have had 105 or 106, I'm not sure, amendments. That is roughly one amendment in every 8 months. Now, if you go back to the parable of that person who keeps on changing his suit, when you find that there is the constitution needs a change, an amendment, every 8 months, won't you come to the conclusion that you would need a new constitution? I submit before you that you would, and that is necessary. It was a change is necessary, a new constitution is necessary. Just as the Frenchmen have new republics, we now need a new republic. There are several other provisions in the constitution which require a relook. Now, we are not debating on if we need a change in the constitution, what are the changes. But nevertheless, I will allude to certain changes that we need to do it. There are no provisions in our constitution regarding the democratic principles of initiative, referendum and recall. Initiative, referendum and recall, I have no time to elaborate on these things, but these are very fundamental democratic principles, and if we don't have these provisions, there are the electorate or the general public is powerless before a person or before a government whom they have rightly or wrongly elected some years back, and they have to suffer the government for 5 years. Now, I am not saying that it is topical in the present time, but we'll let it rest at that. But apart from initiative, referendum and recall, there are certain provisions in the Constitution which have not been used, which require to be used. Say, for instance, the habeas corpus has been referred to by several speakers. Now, there is another writ which is provided in the Constitution which is called quo warranto. Quo warranto means that if you ask of a person who has been elected, who is in some public office, whether that person is fit to occupy that public office or not. If he has been fomenting vociferous tendencies, if he has been fomenting or creating trouble, creating disaffection between different parts of the population, then the people should have the right to recall or the right to ask for a writ of quo warranto. That has never been used. That is a thing which is the jurist to decide. But it is there, it is something that time is running short, but I will end. Before I end, I have to quote certain jurists, very eminent jurists. One of them is Lord Denning. Many of you have heard of him, very, very eminent jurist who is very often quoted in Indian courts. Lord Denning had said, law is a living organism that evolved with society adapting to changing needs and circumstances. Now, from 1950 to 2024, haven't we changed our needs and circumstances? Haven't we? I am grateful to Mr. Bhupen Roy, which I was saying right at the beginning, that we have changed. There are things like internet, there are things like data security, there are things like artificial intelligence, climate change, which were inconceivable in 1950. So, on the basis of this, do we not need a new constitution, or shall we go on amending ad infinitum until we are tired of amending? There is great emphasis has been laid on basic structure. Even the basic structure is not immutable. Who said it is immutable? We have ourselves given up that constitution. It has not been given by some divinity. It has not fallen from heaven. We have ourselves given us that constitution, and under changed circumstances we can change that constitution. There are several other things which time would not permit me to elaborate upon. I just mentioned one point that Mr. Prosenjit Bose on the proposition side had mentioned. He had said India is a very old civilization, and therefore what we have from in the 1950 constitution is something which is the distillate of all that civilization. But ladies and gentlemen, imagine, could we ever, in these 5,000 years of life in India, could we ever think of anything like partition and mass migration from one part of the country to another? We had it in 1947. It is still going on. We had it on the Western Front in 1947. In the Eastern Front, it is still going on. It happened in spots, but it is still going on, like squeezing toothpaste out of a tube. Now, do these things not need a new constitution? Do we not need to elaborate, to think afresh, instead of trying to improve upon a constitution which has so far undergone amendments, one in every 7 months or 8 months? I submit, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, that we do it. There were several other points, but we rest at that. And I submit before you, ladies and gentlemen, and Mr. Moderator, that it is essential that we must have a new constitution. We cannot but have a new constitution. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Thank you. This brings us to the end of the schedule of speakers, and now, as is customary, we have one speaker on each side to sum up the entire argument of that side. As is tradition, we're going to ask the opposition to sum up first, and summing up on behalf of the opposition is going to be Professor Sugata Bose. I'm afraid, Professor Bose, you have 4 minutes in view of the fact that a lot of your team members have overstepped the time. But being a democratic process, we will also give only 4 minutes to the other side.
Mr. Chairman, sir, I humbly accept the curtailment of our summing up to 4 minutes as disciplined members of this House. We all know that the preamble to our Indian Constitution is truly very beautiful. The Honorable Chief Minister stressed that point. What beautiful words: liberty, equality, fraternity, and preceded by justice. And I was actually quite moved while I was hearing Alka Lamba say Jai Sangvidhan. But unfortunately, there are critical clauses and articles in the Constitution that do not conform to the preamble of the Constitution. When we send out our students and youth to recite the preamble of the Constitution, we should be responsible. And we should also tell them that the same Constitution's clauses can be misused by an authoritarian government in order to put them in prison without any trial. I would, in my summing up, of course, stress what we have argued from this side of the House, that this is a colonial inheritance, that all of the worst features of authoritarianism under British rule we have kept and preserved in the post-independence Indian Republic. But I would also like to directly address the elephant in the room that Mr. Prosenjit Bose spoke about. There is this fear that if we call for a new constitution, or if we even acknowledge the need for a new constitution, aren't we playing into the hands of those who believe in religious majoritarianism and centralized authoritarianism? To that, I would say that we from this side of the House are not talking about a new constitution tomorrow. All that we are saying that let us be bold enough to engage in a battle of ideas. And I said that this motion is defeated because a post-colonial constitution retaining numerous states of exception to the rule of law do not provide us sufficient safeguards against either religious majoritarianism or centralized authoritarianism. This is to accept defeat. If we accept that Narendra Modi and the forces of Hindutva want to go forward on their authoritarian route and establish a de jure Hindu Rashtra, then I will have to say that you are giving him a walkover. They don't quite need a new constitution to go on their journey of majoritarianism and authoritarianism. All that they need to do is to translate the worst clauses that are still retained in the constitution into Sanskritic Hindi and deploy that for their authoritarianism and majoritarianism. That is why we need a new constitution for the future, to be crafted by a new generation of Indians who are committed to egalitarianism, to federalism, and to religious harmony. I will end simply by quoting the greatest president that the United States ever had, Abraham Lincoln. And he had said that every people has a constitutional right to amend the Constitution that they have been given, and also a revolutionary right to overthrow it. But we, from this side of the House, have been very constructive. We have suggested that we need a new constitution, and we have even gone further to suggest what the lineaments of a new democratic and federal constitution of India might look like. So I ask you all to exercise your wisdom, your judgment, to reject the defeatist, negativist motion that has been placed before you. Jai Hind.
And before you exercise that judgment, between you and the judgment is going to be a representative speaking for the Muslim, Bhupen Roy. You have 4 minutes, sir.
Hello. I am a little confused because I think the opposition has damned our proposition with faint praise. Nobody has said that outright we should throw it out, and nobody has been able to say, all 4 speakers, what it will replace with. What is their proposition? Why should we throw it out? I would say that the concept of use and throw is a Western imperialistic and colonial concept. Because when we use single-use plastics, use and throw razors, this is a mentality of the West where you cannot make things enduring. The second thing is that the attack on the Indian Constitution, that it is based on the Government of India Act 1935, I would like to remind you that the British did not come to India in 1935. They won the Battle of Plassey in 1757. It was through freedom struggle. It was through a lot of upheaval. It was through a lot of fight that the Government of India Act 1935 came. And just because it was, see, if you say that the automobile is patterned after the T model Ford, therefore it is an imperialistic car, will not be right. You were just putting labels on the Constitution, giving the dog a bad name to kill it. All four speakers, we had 5 speakers actually, because the keynote speaker very categorically said that she does not want a new constitution. But all 4 speakers who have spoken against the motion, 2 of them were very muted. They were making legal quibbles. They were saying there are a lot of good things in the constitution, there are some bad things in the constitution. So, but only one of them said categorically that we need a new constitution. There is no argument. Constitution is a guiding principle. There are secondary laws and there are fundamental rights that are there. Nobody has said, except one, that there is nothing called the basic structure of the Constitution. So we have to follow the basic structure, and today, if you have to argue for a new Constitution, you must say what you want. What is wrong with the Constitution that cannot be righted by amendments? We have done it for 107 times, we will do it for another 50 times. So, this is not a defeatist motion. We are saying that there is no case made by the opposition as to why we need to throw out our Constitution. We are all in agreement, and actually we all agree that a living document which guides the lives of 1.4 billion people need to be changed. Someone talked about Darwin, and Darwin said that in order to survive, it is not the strongest or the fittest or the most intelligent. It is that species which can adapt itself. So therefore, we need a constitution which will adapt itself. I will leave with you a thought, as I have been a business consultant all my life. I think what we need is a tool called scenario planning. If then, we need to not sit down and say what happened in 1935, what happened, what Bhagat Singh said, what Kamath said, what Netaji said. Yes, of course, that's part of history. They will teach them in the history classes. We need a scenario planning process whereby the future challenges that are coming, how will this constitution adapt to those future challenges and become a living document that we are all proud of. Thank you. I hope you will vote for the motion.
Thank you. And before you vote for the motion discussed with the moderator, to very briefly sum up some of the thoughts that must be playing in your mind and which will influence your judgment. We all heard about the preamble to our Constitution. Ladies and gentlemen, do you know the most beautiful words in that preamble? They are the words, we the people. It is we the people that have given us this Constitution. We have heard a lot of arguments of why this Constitution has failed. And one of the important arguments we've heard is the complete failure of federalism. We heard it in the keynote speech by our Honorable Chief Minister even before the debate began. With a lot of speakers has talked about an elephant in the room. But what we have seen in West Bengal is not an elephant in the room, but two elephants in the room, one from the center and one from the state, fighting each other in the confines of the room. And can you imagine what has happened to the inhabitants in terms of federalism? Federalism has talked about double-engine train, meaning a train that is pulled by one engine and pushed by the other. But when you live in West Bengal, we have double-engine trains, one engine pulling in each direction. And can you imagine what happens to the passengers that occupy the compartments in between? And that has been failed federalism as well. We've heard the argument that too many changes necessitate a complete change. Somebody talked about the person who needs to change his clothes every few minutes should have a complete overhaul of clothes. The worry is you don't want it to become like the emperor's. We've all been told that the two pillars of our constitutional democracy has been the judiciary and the media. In this country, the judiciary is appointed in dark rooms, attended by the executive and the judiciary themselves. Previously, it had more judiciary, less executives. Now, worryingly, it has more executives and less judiciary, deciding on which judiciary should be the people who will ultimately interpret the Constitution itself. The biggest criticisms of the Constitution comes from the media. And we have seen what our political masters all over the country, in the center and in the states, have done to stop that criticism. They have bought up the media. And it makes you wonder whether it's time that we address these issues rather than think of changing the whole Constitution. The question this debate has thrown up is, do we just need changes, or do we really need a metamorphosis? Because you need to paint and repair your house regularly, do you need to change your house or demolish it and build a new one? Because one of your organs in the body has been troubling you and you need medicines regularly, perhaps even surgery. Does that mean you should go to a transplant surgeon and have that organ replaced completely? I think the motion that we're debating today, India does not need a new constitution, is fundamentally a debate between those who think that there is need for change and those who think there is change of the need itself. And I think we should consider this. Is there a need for change of the Constitution? Or is there a need of change of the process of accountability for those who uphold, interpret, and criticize our Constitution? And I leave you with these thoughts as I ask you to raise your hands if you think that the motion for today, this House believes India does not need a new constitution, has been carried. In that case, please raise your right hands. Maybe you can help with the counting, Jimmy? You're better at counting than I am. Okay, so why don't we ask those that are against the motion and think that India does need a new constitution to raise your hands? Jimmy, it looks like a very narrow margin, but I think we have to say that the proposition has carried today. Congratulations, and thank you very much. You've been a great audience.
I request everybody to kindly be seated. And ladies and gentlemen, it is a very enthralling debate.
lot of heart-to-heart discussions. And now it's time for us to felicitate our honorable speakers right here. And I'd like to call on, yes, Mr. Satyam Roy Choudhury, founder, MD, and Vice Chancellor of Nivedita University, and of course Mr. Dhruva Mukherjee, CEO of the ABP Group. Along with that, I'd also like to call on the President of Calcutta Club, Dr. Arjit Ghosh, and the First Lady, Dr. Geeta Ghosh, to kindly felicitate our amazing speakers we have this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, I think at least it's going to be about 5 minutes. We'd really appreciate if you be kindly seated, because it's been really a beautiful debate, and we owe it to all the amazing gentlemen and of course the single lady on stage. And just to tell you all, after the felicitation, we'd like a group photo. So, amazing sketches, an amazing plaque. This is truly amazing. A memorable felicitation, I would say, which will always be etched in the memories as we travel over the years. The speakers and the moderator, everybody would like you all to kindly come for a group photograph, please.
Yeah.